Welcome to the Magnificast, a podcast about Christianity and leftist politics. I'm your co-host, Dean Detloff.
And I'm your other co-host, Matt Bernico. Dean, I gotta tell you, there's a trend in podcasting that I really hate, and that is people moving to video content. I hate the idea of seeing who's talking. That's bad, for sure. You got the Joe Rogans of the world out there sitting face-to-face in a studio talking to one another, and it's such a bad aesthetic and a deeply cursed vibe. I don't like it.
And I know that is the one thing that you like the least about Joe Rogan. You've told me that before.
That's true. Great point. If I had my way, and since this is my podcast, I guess I can't have my way, I think that we should start adopting a new aesthetic. We need a late night podcast aesthetic. Like, ditch the Joe Rogan vibe for a Conan O'Brien vibe, where we've got you in a suit that's a little bit too big. You're standing up. You're giving everyone your best, like, cold opens. So, Dean, if I could just put you on the spot right now, can you do a cold open? Can you do one?
Whoa. You hear about this? You hear about that? Let me think. I'm just kind of testing out my Leno to find out if I can do a cold open. I feel like I'd need a whole team of writers. I think that's the thing they don't tell you about these late night shows. They have a whole team of writers coming up with great bits, and we'd have to assemble a crack team. I don't think I could improv my way through it, but what I could offer instead of that is I think a lot of creativity around sort of organizing means of putting Christian celebrities into, like, embarrassing youth group game scenarios. Like, you know, Jimmy Fallon, he's got whoever, Justin Timberlake out there making a fool of himself, getting pied in the face or whatever. I feel like we could really pull that off. We could get some Christian celebrities on here. We could get Justin Bieber. We could get Julie Chen. They could all come on the show. And I'd have them balance an egg between their nose and eyes or something across the stage. And I feel like that's the kind of creativity I could really bring.
That's great. I can't wait for the inaugural episode, the big launch, where we have the one Christian guy from the Blue Man Group on to do to do a youth group game where he has to reach his hand into a trash bag full of gummy worms or something. I think
he could be the band leader.
Oh, that would be really cool. That's such a great idea. Has anyone ever done Blue Man Group at church? I know the answer is yes, I'm sure.
Yeah, the answer is yes for sure. I feel like it could be, that guy could be the band leader, but the band would be Five Iron Frenzy, and Reese Roper would just kind of be around. Maybe Reese Roper would be sort of the sidekick to the show, the guy who chimes in, because obviously the band leader, being a blue man, couldn't speak. That's a sacred vow that he has taken. So
it's a huge problem.
It would be, this would be the gimmick. It would be the first co-hosted late night Christian talk show featuring a blue man and Five Iron Frenzy. I feel like what could possibly go wrong? That's the market niche that hasn't been filled.
Every digression and iteration of this conversation that we have, I feel like is just losing the plot a little bit more and more to this podcast. And fair enough. But I swear this does actually have something to do with what we're talking about. So, Dean, we're often just reading books on this podcast. We're talking about esoteric Christian leftists that have, who are no longer with us. Things that have taken place in the 1970s and the 1980s. But this week, we're going to just talk about some of the headlines. Maybe in a less than Jay Leno kind of way.
More of a Letterman kind of thing. You just want 10 strong headlines. I should have done my homework ahead of this.
That's right. I have maybe 2 strong headlines. But anyways, this week we're going to bracket some of the great stuff that happened 40 plus years ago, and we're going to come up for air and take a look around in the world and see like what are the trends in Christianity today. Don't tell Christianity Today I said that, because if I say their name on the podcast, I do have to give them 25 cents.
If you say it 3 times, one of the bizarre lost children of Billy Graham shows up behind you in a mirror.
Nobody wants that. That's too scary. Scarier than Beetlejuice, that's for sure. So this week we're going to just take a quick look at like what are the trends in Christianity and how do Christians interpret them, and maybe what do they mean for us as people who are in the midst of Christianity but not always very excited about it. We'll kind of get to how I got to this moment to come up with this episode in a minute, but we're going to be taking a look at some of the big trends and stats around declining church membership and also declining or varying theological beliefs that people have, and sort of the surveys and statistics people have drummed up to tell that story.
Maybe it's worth pointing out too. This is maybe a global north themed theme. What I'm trying to say is, in the global south, the situation is different, and also not in a uniform way. It's different across the global south too. Asia, Africa, Latin America, the Middle East. They're not the same places, but all the big demographic researchers on Christianity are showing that in the global south, Christianity is on the rise, especially in Africa and Asia in particular, and also the ways in which it is growing are interesting. Lots of evangelicals and lots of Pentecostalism showing up, and even some Catholicism. But all that to say, the situation is different in the north. So we're going to spend some time maybe trying to process what's going on up here, and what it means to be a Christian, knowing that your religion is like slowly fading away in the country where you live, amidst a pretty bad political situation in general. I feel like that's a good theme, but just to mark maybe the geographical bias on purpose of the episode.
Yeah, no, I think that's a pretty good note to make. And I also think it's a good thing to kind of keep at the front of our mind that it is 2024 in the year of our Lord, and the global north looks a really particular way, and that is not it is markedly different than Nicaragua in 1980 or something, right? If liberation theology is doing theology from a particular historical situation, paying attention to class, then we should probably pay attention to like what the historical situation is that we're living in for a hot second.
Right.
I don't want to look around so desperately. I want to keep my head buried in this great book, but in a really well designed Orbis book. But we have to take a peek about what's happening in the world. Okay. So quickly, just to transition into like what we're going to talk about. Church attendance is on the decline. People tell that story in a lot of different ways, and we'll talk about some specifics of it with regard to where Dean and I live in the world. As two people who are not in the U.S., but who are very U.S., the story is strikingly similar, I think, actually, in a lot of these places in the global north. But I got thinking about all of this this past week because the Church of Scotland, which is the big one, the big Protestant denomination in Scotland, had a General Assembly this past week, and there were some really interesting theological and ecclesiological moments that came out of that meeting that I thought were worth kind of like having a discussion about, or at least brought me to think more about like what the role of Christianity and churches are in 2024. In a sort of like post-Christian sort of society, which I guess is a loaded term in and of itself, but whatever. Anyways, so the Church of Scotland at their General Assembly, they made a statement about a ceasefire in Gaza, which you love to see. If you're going to be a moral voice in the world, you might as well be a moral voice in the world and actually speak out against things that are really happening and not made up culture war stuff. So that's great. I love that. It's good. The coolest thing. The other thing that I thought was actually really interesting that came out of this Church of Scotland meeting was some theologizing around trans people in the church. And this is something, I mean, okay, the calling for a ceasefire is great. And these things are not really like related, I guess. But these two progressive ideas kind of came out. I think, though, that like standing up for trans people in Scotland and in the UK in general is a pretty gutsy move, and it's one that's not going to make you exceedingly popular. The culture war in the United States, I think, is bad around trans people, but it is a particular type of nasty, I think, in the UK.
Turf Island.
Yeah, Turf Island. They that name does not come from nowhere. Turf Island is a very real thing that does exist. I was not prepared for it coming in here. But the theological statement that the Church of Scotland gave around trans people is very good. Not only does it affirm that a trans person can be a minister or can be an elder, but trans people are cool. That's what it says. No, that they're, that they have a particular moral worth that I think a lot of people in the world would not want to give them. So let me read this bit here, and I'll get to what this has to do with declining church stuff in a minute. But during the recent General Assembly of the Church of Scotland, The theological forum brought forward like this like bigger statement about trans people and that they are a part of the church and should not be prohibited from becoming members or holding office. Very cool. So this is a quote from this is a quote from the General Assembly. Currently, there's no consideration of sex or gender for anyone joining the Church of Scotland or holding office as an elder, reader, or deacon, ordained local minister, or minister of word and sacrament. And then it goes on to say, we've spoken with transgender Christians and also spoken with a Christian detransitioner, someone who's transitioned in the past but has now detransitioned back to their birth gender, which is, I guess, an interesting perspective. And despite a wide range of theological political views present in the forum, we're unanimous in reaching the following conclusion. First, building on the church's existing statements on transgender people, we believe that transgender people should be loved and respected and welcomed into our congregation. And it goes on to say, it is the foundation of Christian ethics that all people are made in the image of God and are worthy of our respect and love, and this is true of transgender people also. And then another bit here. This is, I think, where it even gets cooler. Yet, second, and based on our exploration of gender in the Bible, this forum is also unanimous in believing that transgender people should not only be welcomed in our church, but allowed to serve in our church. That the church should not treat transgender people differently from others, but after considering their giftings and calling, should admit them to office if we believe God wills it. This is very cool. A great theological affirmation after some time of, reflection about whether or not trans people can be in ministry or can be leaders in their churches. And in the Church of Scotland, at least, it is the case that they can. I checked in with local Church of Scotland expert and friend of the show, William Gibson, on this, and he told me that actually there's never been a rule that says that trans people could not be involved in church leadership or in ministry. This is just more of like a theological explanation of like what's going on there. So pretty cool. I like all of this. You love to see like a good thing happening in the world amidst so many bad and stupid things. So I was thinking about all of this, and I was reading some of the comments and the tweets about it, and as you can imagine, they're bad. So like the very day that this pronouncement came out, this theological statement came out, there's also an article that came out that said a majority of people in Scotland do not believe in any religion, which is very funny, a very funny way to put it. The article, it's from The Guardian. It says data from the latest Scottish census carried out in 2022 shows 51% of the population reported that they belong to no religion, a sharp increase on the 36.7 in 2011. The census found that the people who identified with the Church of Scotland had slumped by more than a third over the decade, falling from 32.4% of the population in 2011 to 20.4 or 1.1 million in 2022. So, and also the Guardian article does round out saying Catholics in Scotland also fell dramatically to 15.9 to 13.3. So it's some pretty big changes in the ways that people are identifying religiously. And anyways, these two things falling on the exact same day, you can imagine what the comments were, right? People were saying, "Oh, of course, the membership or attendance is down in Church of Scotland churches, or religious identification is down in these churches. It's because they are like open and affirming of transgender people, like making this like absolutely asinine link, which I think is stupid for a lot of reasons, illogical, unsound, dumb, but." I think that is such an interesting observation, or I think that like that people do that they jump to that kind of conclusion that like when churches go astray or when they start teaching too liberal of stuff, when they're too woke, right? That's when people stop showing up, which I doubt. I mean, that's just not true. I don't think.
Yeah.
It's such a funny idea that like. People weren't going to church before this either. I don't know. It's not like this was like the tipping point, the straw that broke the camel's back, I guess. But I guess this gets at kind of a bigger question that I think is quite interesting. Like you were saying, Dean, in the global north, Christianity is on the decline. And I'm not here to say good, but I'm not here to say this is bad either. All I'm trying to say is that there's a type of Christianity that might exist beyond like the terrifying stats of what happens when your church building has to close or something like that.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, this is, as I said maybe earlier, like it's a common story. It's not just Scotland. I mean, there's basically virtually the same thing happening in Canada, although with some different contours, importantly different contours, I guess. But the general story of like Christianity is on the decline is pretty common in the North generally. In Europe, it's much more advanced. For example, the trend is more advanced, but it's also happening in the U.S. And I think there is a lot of talk about like why that is, trying to identify why that is. I've never read like a good explanation that boils it down to exactly one factor or issue that feels convincing to me. Definitely not because, I don't know, churches are accepting trans people, because Catholics, for example, are also declining. So it's like, there's a pretty clear, like, statistical way of kind of debunking those speculations. But a lot of Christians, understandably, I suppose, kind of wring their hands about the decline of Christianity, and it does raise a lot of problems. It raises problems around people's jobs, for example, at a material level. It raises problems around all the important programming that churches provide. I think those are the things that kind of get lost in the headlines about like faith identity. And it also represents maybe existential concerns for people invested in Christianity. But I've always been interested in the way that this gets talked about in Quebec, for example, where it is a rapidly secularizing country and has been since the 60s. And I remember talking to a bishop when I used to write as a journalist, who was saying, we've lost the ability to like take for granted the fact that the entire population will basically go to mass. But at the same time, that raises a lot of important questions, like, if they don't feel like compelled to go to mass just because, then like maybe that's our fault and not theirs. Like it raises important questions about what Christianity is doing and who it's for and so on, and kind of presents an opportunity for Christians to rediscover why it is they are Christian in the first place. It's kind of all that like old Kierkegaard stuff, like when everybody is a Christian in your country, it's actually really hard to figure out what does it mean to be a Christian person, because you can't really like differentiate yourself by listening to the community, the interpretive community of Christianity. So all that to say, I think it's important to start processing what all that could mean and does mean. And I've met a lot of pretty gifted seminarians who are thinking all that through in Canada. I feel like it's a pretty live conversation, but it is gonna be an important one for those of us who are Christians on the left, in particular, I think, to sort out. Like, what do you do when, for whatever reason, you can't quit this faith tradition, but people are leaving it, and you're compelled to figure out how to tie it to, people's motivations for a different kind of world, different kind of society.
Yeah, I agree. It is definitely something to think about for people, Christians on the left, all of the, whether you live in Canada or the UK or in the United States, there's a bunch of us weirdos running around out there who go to church despite all of this in one way or the other, right? I think there's another reason to maybe think about it a bit more too, and that is because this particular talking point is, I think, a big part of the like motivation behind some strands of Christian nationalism that what makes America good, what makes it great even, is that the founding fathers founded it on Christian principles, and country of people who continue to go to church and like find those values to be the most important, that is a country that is going to work well, right? It's a model of society where the assumption is that politics is downstream from religion, which is a very bad assumption. But I think that I was just poking around a little bit too, because I was, like you said, Dean, there's not like a great explanation that I think has been exhaustive or has satisfied my curiosities. But whenever I read right-wing takes on what this might mean, that's always the kind of default, or like that's what they shift to, is that Christianity needs to remain a dominant force in society, not because of faithfulness or any theological importance, but because like that's what makes a country good, is the subscription to a certain set of values that are not really that Christian to begin with. But anyways, another reason to be concerned about this conversation, I think, maybe from a different angle. Yeah,
it's that standard thing where fascist impulses come out when you have a situation of crisis, because people want to hold on to a position that they may be losing, or they recognize that they're losing ground on a number of fronts, and so you kind of double down on the thickest bizarre identity you can find and make that the rallying cry. But I think that's true, and maybe it's another reason to imagine what does it look like to have a kind of left expression of Christianity when the options on offer are either people are like leaving Christianity for usually no faith at all or some other faith tradition, or the kind of loudest voices, or maybe the voices that seem to get like the most curiosity from like the press and the public, are like the furthest right. I mean, I feel like it's every other day there's a new headline about how young Catholics are secretly, or maybe not so secretly, very interested in hyper-traditionalist religion, which is just simply not true. Like, young Catholics obviously are not interested in that because the faith is declining, so they are leaving the church, and it seems like the kind of causal factors for that are hard to pin down, but important to keep track of all those trends if you're a person who thinks that there's a way of expressing the Christian tradition that doesn't have to be a invocation of a lost or non-existent past, or kind of the defense of our Christian values in the present or whatever. And I think there's a lot of unanswered questions even on that. Like, even progressive Christians, it seems to me, are doing a lot of good work thinking through, like, how do you wind down very well, or in an ethical way, or in a just way, and so on. And I think those are really important questions. But there's also lots of important questions around, like, okay, but if you're still around, like, what are you supposed to do? And how do you do that?
Yeah, I think that's a great point. Something we were briefly joking about before we started recording this was, in the 70s and 80s, you get people like Hugo Asman and Juan Segundo, and they're talking about, they're liberation theologians, by the way, in case you don't know those names, which is totally fair. But they're talking about, like, what particularities do Christians bring to revolutionary struggle? And I feel like in the global north, we have the opposite. Like, what ways can Christians on the left co-opt Christianity in maybe not a particular way, just in a material way or something? Or there's like a negative version of that, where it's just like, we don't really want to be Christian, we want to be involved in justice in some other way, but we can't quite escape the orbit of having to contribute a particular thing from Christianity. I don't know. It's all very silly, but like you said, Dean, I think it's an important thing to sort out. Like, what does it mean? What are we contributing here as Christians who are on the left in a world where churches are like on the decline?
Yeah, you read some stats about Scotland, which I think are great. Maybe just to get some other perspective on the table here.
They're great stats. You love these stats. You love the decline of the Church of Scotland. Oh, man. That big Catholic energy over there. You're really getting some revenge.
That's right. I love that quantitative measure of a bummer for the Protestants, for sure. Yeah, but I think it's helpful to kind of get a sense of exactly what the scale is of all this, too. For example, in 2019, I remember there was a big headline going around that this heritage group had said Canada will likely lose 9,000 churches in the next decade from that time, which is pretty wild. And it is already happening. Like, you see churches closing constantly. There are whole dioceses in Canada and in the US that are restructuring, and it's not just a Protestant problem. Catholics are too. The United Church, which is like an incredibly unique Canadian phenomenon, but it's a congregational church made up of a variety of Protestant denominations. But it's kind of like, if Canada had a Church of Canada, that is what it would be. It's the biggest Protestant denomination in Canada. It is also declining more than any other denomination, and similar maybe to the Church of Scotland. Like, it's known as a progressive church. They take pretty strong progressive stands. I mean, a pretty cool church, to be honest. They do a lot of very important work, and I find it a bummer that they are declining, but they're declining faster than everybody else. And lastly, Catholicism is strangely not declining in Canada nearly as rapidly as the Protestants, and depending on who you read, it may even be increasing in some places. Quebec, again, a very particular kind of wrinkle in all this story, but the reason for that is primarily due to immigration. So people coming to Canada who come from a Catholic country, bringing Catholic faith, and the kind of generational transmission of that faith is an open question. People don't really know how that's going to sort out, so it's not really a stable trend. All that to say, it is Christianity is facing a kind of existential crisis, I guess, in Canada too. And it's not just Canada and Scotland, these kind of countries in the orbit of, I don't know, the UK one way or another, but in the US as well. It is, identification as a nun is increasing. That's a headline you see quite rapidly, but also regular church attendance is pretty well declining, especially after the pandemic. And all that to say, I think that poses some really big problems, even for something as simple as trying to think about the important movements that are funded by the church, literally financially funded by the church. Many movements in the global south, and including here in the north, are funded by church denominations. I'm the United Church in Canada. They fund lots of really cool stuff going on in Cuba, for example, as we've learned from Jim Hodgson on the show, or in the DPRK, as we learned from Patty Talbot on the show, right? These are pretty unique constituencies, for lack of a better term, from which you can kind of raise funds and direct those funds to important projects and kind of systematic change projects, or they're sort of communities that have a wider view of justice and can do things like advocating for trans people or other marginalized folks in a unique way with a broad horizon of justice that you kind of lack in a more generic liberal schema, those kinds of things. I think the decline of Christianity is a decline that will also mean the loss of some pretty important prophetic structures and prophetic voices, for lack of a better adjective. And I think, Christians on the left have to kind of figure out how are we going to navigate that situation, even as we watch the faith traditions that mean a lot to us or that we can't quit or whatever are slowly on the decline.
Yeah, I mean, maybe on that point, another story that you hear quite a bit about the declining church membership or identification as a nun or identification as something else altogether is that the breakdown of that decline is the onus is particularly on people who are politically on the left or political liberals, as a lot of the Gallup polls have said. In one of the Gallup polls, it says that attendance rates since 2020 are lower among nearly every major subgroup. The main exception are groups that had low levels of church attendance before the pandemic, including adults with no religious affiliation and political liberals. That people on the left are already kind of allergic to church is not news to people on this podcast. But I think the story that ends up getting told from that particular perspective is that there's maybe something there's a social psychology about people who are further on the left in church that they don't want to be associated with an institution that sucks in all the ways that we know that it sucks or something. So I don't know. That's another story where we want to be free from the free from the shackles of Christianity in general to pursue more unalloyed and pure types of political activism or belief or something. And if that's you, fair enough. I would not blame anybody for not going to church for any reason. I don't want to go most days. But I think that also tells I don't know. There's a little bit of a bias there that does not recognize those social movements you were just talking about, or the long history of solidarity movements within Christianity and so on. But it just does not do justice to that story, and that's too bad, I think.
Yeah, I think so too. And I mean, we said we were going to talk about contemporary trends and not talk about the 70s and 80s, but too late.
Here he goes. Here he
goes. When I think about these past social movements that were really significant, or just to take one, for example, the anti-apartheid struggle in South Africa, I remember talking with a communist organizer that I met at a steelworkers thing. And I was asking him about I knew that he was really active in the anti-apartheid struggle. And I asked him, what did he think made that campaign work really well? And he said, well, of course, like, as a communist, he was like, of course, the communist movement was really important. Who knows how important in the end, I couldn't say. But he said the other major kind of group of people that you could count on to be against apartheid were Christians and people of faith. And he was saying he was like, I'm not a Christian, he's a regular run-of-the-mill Marxist guy. But he said there's something about that commitment to justice and even the commitment to an imagination about justice that's beyond our world that really kind of gets people going. There's like a moral vocabulary there. And you see that story in so many other examples in the 20th century in particular. The civil rights movement is obviously a big example. Lots of kind of, I don't know, people listen to this podcast can think of dozens of others, but lots of examples where it was really important that Christians actually found a way to get going, or there are Christian figures that were kind of pivotal to this or that social movement, largely, I think, because of that that kind of way of having a broader horizon for social justice. And I think it's not to say that Christianity is the only thing that can do that. I don't think that is true. It's obviously not true. But given the uniqueness of how Christians kind of come together and form communities and networks and even have kind of global connections and so on, the decline in people even being in touch with each other through those networks means that we're also losing that historical memory. We're losing those kinds of habits, those kinds of connections, those traditions and so on that have historically been like pretty pivotal to making change in society. And I do think that is like a problem for everybody. It's not just a problem for Christians. It's a problem for other progressives and people on the left as well, because I don't know, in my experience, like, it's true that some people who leave Christianity do end up kind of throwing themselves even harder into social justice because they're kind of freed from, I don't know, whatever shackles of religion they had on them. And I think that is fine. It makes sense to me. But the majority of people I meet who kind of leave Christianity just sort of are deactivated, or it's not like they're, leaving Christianity and becoming more invested in social justice necessarily. It's you kind of just get thrown into like the incredibly degrading world of like liberal capitalism, which doesn't have much of an imaginary going for it, and becomes, a rough place to be. So I don't know. I'm trying to like toe the line here. Like, I don't want to say Christianity is like essential to having a good society in the global north. I don't think that necessarily, but I do think that the loss of Christianity means the loss of like a really unique vector of activation.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. I mean, say what you will about Christianity, but there is a certain amount of like social cohesion that has to go with it. And losing that isn't always positive. And in fact, like you said, there's some negative to it. I think that there's maybe something that we should probably talk about a bit here, kind of like lurching towards the second half of the conversation. And maybe that's just the tone of the conversation that we're having about this in general, or like how it works on our show. And this is perhaps more of like an existential question than it is like a political one, but maybe it is both, actually. I think that whenever you and I talk about church and stuff like this, Dean, we're always like really like reluctant participants in the whole thing. We are just two satellites caught in the orbit of a big planet called Christianity, and for some reason we're still here because we can't quite escape. What do you think about that part of it?
Oh man, trying to get really introspective here.
Yeah.
I don't know. I mean, I think we hear from enough people who listen to the show that is not an uncommon experience, which I think is interesting. I guess for me, we've talked about this on a few other episodes, but I feel like Christianity is a thing that I some days feel sort of like condemned to participate in. Like, whether I like it or not, I'm just gonna do it for my whole life. And I feel like even if I tried to quit it, it would just be impossible for me to do. Like, I would be haunted by it in ways that would make me attached to it in an unhealthy way. So it's like easier for me to just accept the problems and try to navigate them. So that's how I feel on some days. But it's not always like a purely negative thing either. Like, there are lots of other days where I feel like Christianity is a really generative force in my life. It connects me to people, traditions, geographies, etc., that I would never have likely connected to outside of my participation in Christianity. And, you know, in a deep down way, I do think that, like, the person of Jesus is important and gives me a particular, I don't know, ethical and moral and theological orientation in the world that I think is unique and essential to my way of understanding it, for better or for worse, all that kind of stuff. So yeah, I guess, like, for me, looking at those trends of the decline of the church, I feel like it's just like, I guess I just have to buckle up for a lot of problems. Like, I work in a church setting, in a church movement. I often have internal questions about, like, man, this is going to be really hard to, like, fund in 50 years. Like, you know, I'm watching the decline of Christian publications, you know, Jesus folding, all these different kinds of things, and just thinking, like, man, where is, like, the money going to come for these kinds of things down the road? But I feel like those are just the problems I've, like, resigned myself to having to deal with, I guess, with the few others of my generation who are going to be left by that time. I don't know. What do you think, Matt, as you kind of look around and have that bizarre orbiting position in Christianity?
Yeah, I mean, I feel the same way. Sometimes you go to church and it's awful, and it's just like, why am I doing this? What am I getting out of this whole situation? I don't really know. And then other times you kind of are able to glimpse a bigger picture of the story of Christianity, and at least as I've constructed it in my brain, and you know, some of the motivating ideas, and it's like, okay, I kind of get this. I understand why I am doing the things that I'm doing. There's something generative here. But it's tough, I think. And it's like, it's tough for me, and I cannot imagine recommending this particular type of life to anybody else. I wouldn't do that. So there's that. I guess there's that kind of reluctance that I have about the whole project, because I know what Christianity looks like when it goes very bad. I know what it looks like from a personal standpoint. I know what it looks like historically, but also I've seen the opposite, and that's very great. Something I've been thinking about kind of a lot when it comes to these topics is, okay, we've had Ryan Cagle on the show before, and we'll probably have to have him again at some point to talk about whatever. This in particular would be great. But he has a lot to say, I think, about what Christianity might look like in the future without, like, a strong institutional church presence, just because of lack of attendance and funding. And I find that usually pretty heartening and pretty motivating, that there's a type of life that exists in the decay of institutions like the church. And I think that is an exciting idea. So I like
he uses that metaphor of composting a lot, which is really fun.
Yeah, for sure. Ryan's a very smart guy. And he has, I think, a really interesting sort of Christian project going on in his own hometown, where he's got, like, a cool free Narcon vending machine, and, you know, he's growing gardens and all kinds of stuff that is rad. He has, like, there's a free store. I don't know, all kinds of great things that I think that that Ryan has, like, figured out, like the Venn diagram of Christianity and, like, sort of, like, interesting mutual aid leftist politics kind of stuff, and, like, where they meet. I think that's really heartening. Like, if that's what the future of Christianity looks like, I think that is probably better than what we have now. The other thing I was thinking, though, is just, like, there's this idea I had probably too many years ago, 6 years ago, about the idea of, like, what do you do when church is dying and it kind of sucks, but you're still sort of caught up in it? And I kind of always came back to the metaphor of squatting, like squatting church. I still kind of come back to that and think of that as sort of a pretty powerful idea. Churches are these, like, very complicated institutions, for sure. But if you're a young person in church, people will just heap responsibilities upon you. And sorry, when I say young person in church, I mean, like, if you're under 40,
under 50.
Yeah, under 50. Okay, fair. If you don't have completely gray hair, they might see you as a young person, and they will heap responsibilities upon you. I don't know. When I started going to an Episcopal church in the United States, like, I probably went, you know, maybe a month or two before I was on the vestry or something. Like, they are desperate, I think, for participation, and especially for buy-in from younger people. And it's not a bad idea to get involved. I mean, you get to see a lot of you get to see a pretty big shit show, honestly, if you get on vestries or on boards of churches or whatever. But it can be a pretty powerful place to sit, especially in big mainline churches that have huge coffers still full of money from donors, of years past or whatever. So, I mean, I'm not just saying to like grab hold of the helm and like use money for cool stuff, but it's not the worst idea in the world. I mean,
yeah,
if you don't do it, somebody far worse than you could. So that's something to consider.
Yeah, that's right. I think that's true. I mean, there is, I think, a problematic fetishization of youth in Christianity these days, and maybe that's like a symptom of decline situations, that people are always trying to look for like how to reinvigorate something or breathe life into it. But at the same time, definitely, I think people should take advantage of those kinds of things. And also, like, on the flip side too, like I work with a lot of aging Catholics who are extremely cool, and they don't really understand how cool they actually are. Like a lot of them have histories of like really fascinating trips to a place like Peru to study with Gustavo Gutierrez, or spending time in Chiapas and getting to know the Zapatistas and, Bishop Samuel Ruiz and so on. And like in Canada, I don't know why they just like don't understand that is extremely unique and like very interesting to me as a formerly young person transitioning into whatever comes after that. And I think that there's a lot to be gained also from being a young person in the church right now, where there is a living memory of all these things like liberation theology, like those kind of stories and connections of solidarity. I've learned a lot from hanging out with old people, basically. And it's always very funny because they tend to be like, it's so exciting to have a young person at church. And my response is usually, it's really exciting to meet somebody who's like old enough to remember all the things that I think are very cool. And you can kind of ask them about it and figure it out. And I think there's that like baton passing moment happening between generations right now. And for me, like, I don't know, maybe this is just being grad school brained or like being obsessed with archives and stuff, but I feel like it's important to kind of gather as much of that information as possible, like receive as much of that wisdom as possible, because it's going to be really essential as the church does decline to figure out like, okay, here's some other experiments in Christianity that we could run again or could learn from, or figure out what didn't work and what needs to be taken forward, all that kind of stuff. So definitely seize the means of Christian production for sure, but also it's like a good opportunity to figure out, how people have already done some pretty rad stuff that goes unnoticed or kind of uncelebrated.
I think that's the closest thing you're going to get to evangelism from this podcast.
That's right. Yeah, be a Christian because you get to meet very cool old people. That's the pitch.
That's right.
Yeah, I think the key to it is to recognize that at some point, like, you'll also be a very old Christian person, right? And it's like, what are you going to pass on to people in a situation where Christianity has dwindled? And again, like, for better and for worse, like, as you said earlier, I think it's easy to get maybe caught in a situation of being like, this is a sad story, and there are sad things about it, but there are also like probably new possibilities that weren't possible when, these countries or peoples or whatever were more homogeneously Christian. So I think the other piece is just like, if Segundo and Asman and many others in Latin America were trying to figure out what does Christianity contribute to a revolutionary situation, like, the question going forward will be like, well, what does the kind of remainder of Christianity contribute to, like, a pluralizing society, or a society that is bound together by basically nothing other than like, you have to go to your job, which is like a pretty shitty way to keep societies together. And I think that actually will become a more interesting and live question. And again, it's something I see in talking with Catholic people I know in Quebec. Like, there are lots of interesting conversations even in that small place, talking about like, what does it mean to to be a Catholic person inhabiting a formerly very, very thick Catholic community that has basically decided, like, en masse, that's not really going to be their future, at least for now. And I think for them, like, for these Catholics at least, it has opened a lot of really creative possibilities, really interesting open questions. It's shaped the church hierarchy in ways that are recognizably different from the Anglo church hierarchy. I don't know. I feel like there's a lot of opportunity there as well. It's just that, the opportunities come with challenges. And one day you'll be an old person who has to pass the baton on to someone else. So, it's good to think from a position of the future as well, I suppose.
Yeah, definitely. There's a book that I always think about when I kind of get in this territory. I'm not a big fiction reader, but I read this book called The Canticle for Leibowitz, which is a really interesting post-apocalyptic novel that's supposed to be warning you about nuclear warfare, and I think it does a great job of that, honestly. But one of the big plot pieces in the book is that how has Western society survived, or what of Western society has survived after a nuclear war. And the book kind of takes these pretty big historical jumps and chunks, but the way that knowledge is transferred after a nuclear bomb explodes and kills a bunch of people is through the persistence of a bunch of monks who just write everything down and copy books like they did in the medieval times. And anyways, it's kind of a fantastical idea. Let's hope it remains a fantastical idea. But it is kind of a good recognition too that Christianity has existed for a long time, and whatever, maybe buildings will be sold off and unfortunately turned into bougie gentrified apartments or whatever. But Christianity is a thing that will probably outlive a lot of that, and it'll change in form, but hopefully, it'll change in form. It'll also change in substance, but maybe the substance will just get better, but maybe not too. I guess remains to be seen.
Yeah, I think too, it's important for progressive folks to stick with the church insofar as they can as it declines, because the means by which churches decline are things that have to be decided upon. And for example, I've been really interested to follow some conversations among Anglicans in Canada and some United Church people too about what happens to church property, especially in a massive housing crisis when real estate values are gigantic. And there's a temptation to just sell it off and then I don't know, put that into pastors' pensions or whatever, which pastors should get pensions for sure. But there are other kinds of things going on that are important to think about when it comes to what you do with a building and what kind of responsibility you have with property. There's talk, for example, around Anglicans turning churches into land trusts that are, owned by community, determined by community, and not by a condo developer or whatever. There are church buildings that have been retrofitted into intentionally and legally binding low-income housing, stuff like that. There was a great example here in Ontario of a bunch of religious orders who are aging, and they sold off their residences because they knew that, they weren't going to fill them. And they built a new old folks home, basically retired community living, whatever. And so they're all kind of together spending their last days there. And when they pass, that building will basically be transferred to low income, retirement community and so on. So all that to say, people are already having these kind of interesting conversations about it, but also not in a way that is without bumps. I talked to a lot of folks working on those kind of land issues, and they are pretty transparent about how those are not settled matters in the church, and there are people with different kinds of priorities in the church and so on. So I think it's also kind of an interesting time to participate in those questions. How does a church manage its decline in a just way, and with an awareness of what markets are and how they work and who they serve and who they don't, and what kind of responsibility churches have, not just with property, but all those kinds of issues around money and funding. So all that to say, you can you can really learn a lot of skills that will help you in your labor union, in your weird nonprofits that you are part of, whatever, and vice versa. You can bring all those great skills of having to sit through a budget meeting into a church setting as well.
Yeah, that sounds good. A good sell. Again, another very strange pitch at the Magnificast School of Evangelism. You're not going to get that at the Moody Bible Institute, that's for sure. Different
That's
take.
for sure. This is a different kind of Moody Bible Institute.
We're moody, but about different things. Yeah, cool. Well, I think that is a good wrap of the conversation, right? The church is on decline. Christianity is doing something, and what it will look like in the future is going to be probably different. And wouldn't it be interesting and exciting to be a part of that? Because it's too hard to stop and change your brain from the way that it works. Thanks for listening to the Magnificast. If you like what you heard, you can support us on Patreon at patreon.com/the Magnificast. We got a great Discord there that you'll get invited to when you subscribe. The Discord is better than the podcast. I gotta tell you, it's a lot better. There's more people, more expertise, more interesting conversations. We've been having a kind of ongoing discussion about Tad DeLay's new book about climate denialism, all facilitated by Steven on the Discord. Shout out to Steven. Thank you so much. You're always the book guy, and I appreciate it. Very cool. Anyways, you can join the Discord and also support the podcast. Thank you so much. Our intro music is by Mario Armstrong. Our outro music is by The Logical Spoon, and we'll see you next week.
I don't wanna get up for church in the morning, souls alive. Heaven come to earth and there won't be no church. We'll meet down by the riverside. There we'll swim with all creation. Never get tired, never bored. Don't worry, someday there'll be no dam between us and our Lord.